Hello, and welcome back to our latest episode on Breaking the Spell. We have Douglas and Santosh here, and for today, we're discussing a book review. It's called Caste, Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And so I'll just give a very quick introduction to the book, and we'll have a friendly banter with Douglas, who has also read about 70% of the book. And so today we'll be co-creating the entire journey. We have a rough structure, but we'll flow along as we move along. So to kickstart the episode, I'll just share a bit more about who the author is and why did she write the book. Yeah, so Isabel Wilkerson actually won a Pulitzer Prize when she was a reporter at the New York Times. She's won a National Book Critics Circle Award for a book about the Great Migration called The Warmth of Other Suns. And this is her latest book. It's Caste. And she actually compares, in this book, America with the caste system in India, and writes about how the Nazi leadership borrowed from American racist laws and the American eugenics movement. So in Isabel's own words, this is what she says. She found that the word racism, which is often applied to discussions of interactions among and between African Americans and other groups in the US, she found that term to be insufficient to capture the rigid social hierarchy and the repression that they were born into, and that, in fact, everyone in that regime had to live under. And so she turned to the word caste, which is a word that has been used by anthropologists and social scientists who went in to study the Jim Crow era in the 1930s in particular. And they emerged from their ethnography, they emerged from their time there with the term caste as the language to use to describe what they found when they went there. And so she came to that word as had they. That is the term that is more precise. It is more comprehensive for Isabel, as it gets to the underlying infrastructure that often we cannot see, but there is there undergirding much of the inequality and injustices and disparities that we live with in the US. So I'm just going to share the differences between racism and caste, and then the differences between caste and class, which is another word that we might confound caste with. So on the difference between racism, systemic racism and caste, she says that caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in the same culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race in the US is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. So the beautiful metaphor, which is a very important point to take from the book, caste is the bones. Race is the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. However, caste is a powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place. Just like the bones, they hold the physical structure of the body, caste is that physical infrastructure that holds the societal group in its place. And that allows us to see that race is a tool of the underlying structure that we live with. That race is merely the signal and the cue to where one fits in the caste system. The caste system is actually an artificial hierarchy. It's a graded ranking of human value in a society that determines standing and respect, the benefit of the doubt and access to resources, assumptions of competence, and even of beauty, through no fault or action of one's own. You're just born to it. And so caste focuses on the infrastructure of our divisions and of the rankings, where race is the metric that's used to determine one place in that or one's assignment in that caste system. So while there's an interaction between the two of them, caste is the much more older term. It's the term that's been around for thousands of years. It predates the idea of race, which is a fairly new concept. It's only 400 to 500 years old, dating back to the transatlantic slave trade. And so race is the newer concept. And it was in some ways created to delineate categorize and create the caste system that underlies our society. So the hierarchy, why is caste so important, right? The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings of or morality. It is actually about power. Which groups have power and which groups do not have power. It is about resources. Which caste is seen as worthy of resources and which group or caste is not worthy of resources, which gets to acquire and controls resources and which does not. It's about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not? The use of inherited physical characteristics to differentiate inner abilities and group value may be the cleverest way that a culture has ever devised to manage and maintain a caste system. And so we have what could be called the first pillar of caste, divine will and the laws of nature. The first organizing principles inherent in any caste system is the fixed nature of caste that distinguishes it from class. So this is where we move from distinguishing class, first from caste from race. Now we're moving class and caste, the differences between class and caste. Class is actually an altogether separate measures of one's standing in a society marked by level of education, income, and occupation, as well as the attendant characteristics such as accent, taste, and manners that flow from socioeconomic status. So with the caste system, and it goes about with its work in silence, the string of a puppet master unseen by those whose subconscious it directs, its instructions and intravenous drip to the mind, cast in the guise of normalcy, injustice, looking just, atrocities, looking unavoidable to keep the machinery humming, the matrix of caste as a facsimile for life itself, and whose purpose is maintaining the primacy of those hoarding and holding tight to power. So this is basically, so the difference that she outlines, caste is really about traits which are immutable. You're born with, your race, right? The color of your skin. You can't really change the color of your skin. Or maybe with a certain ethnicity or nationality. Or maybe if you're looking from a more ableist lens, with a certain physical handicap or physical ability. So those are things which are what we call immutable, whereas class is something you can acquire. You can change. And thus there is this concept of mobility with class, but with caste, it's really fixed, it's immutable. So that's the main difference that she describes between class and caste. Yeah. So I think we can stop here about the differences and the introduction of caste, a very quick introduction of the book. Douglas, you have any comments about the introduction and what I've described so far?
Yeah, so thanks, Santosh, for that breakdown of definition. So I think it's really important for viewers, right? If you haven't read the book, you need to know that this is not necessarily a book that is focused on those concepts, like you say, race and class. It is something much more different, maybe you can say much more complex and older, right? Like you said, it predates even some of these notions. And really, when we look at class and race, I think as the way you put it, they can be the surface level indicators. They are used in different ways. They can be not say synonymous with caste, but there's definitely a relationship there, right? So it's just why is this important to differentiate? Because it's what Wilkinson does in this book. She looks at three different social systems. You could say the Nazi system, the Third Reich, America, racism, in terms of its history, and also the Indian caste system. And so you're probably going to have a very interesting discussion whether, her analysis really applies uniformly across these three different settings, right? So it's good to kind of have that kind of analytical rigor. Are we really looking at the same thing when we talk about these three different, social systems and phenomena? So what I want to add in regards, in addition to what you just said, right, is I took some quotes from the book, which I kind of like, to kind of elucidate caste. So one line from the book here, I'm quoting, caste is not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire. And this is from the Dalit leader Bimaro Mbaka. Caste is a notion, is a state of mind. Further on, this another part of the book. The quote goes: caste is more than rank. It's a state of mind that holds everyone captive. The dominant imprisoned in an illusion of their own entitlement. The subordinate trapped in a purgatory of someone else's definition of who they are and who they should be. And so I thought these are very succinct lines, right? To kind of say, there is definitely something happening behind a caste system, right? It is in a way a set of perceptions, attitudes, and values about what kind of people should be on top, what kind of people should be at the bottom. And so there is a dominant group and a subordinate group, right? And the hard questions we have to ask when it comes to interrogating the caste system is what gives the dominant group their privilege, their power, their resources, right? And why is it that the subordinate group is at the bottom? So I think where these things can get complex, and I don't really think there's time for it here, but just to say that, um, why it's so difficult to talk about caste is because it's probably a very rich and complex history. So, when we talk about, say, the Indian caste system, and I'm not even well read on this, right? There is all sorts of different groups, religious, ethnic, I believe even linguistic groups as well, or dialectical groups, right? And there is this, very convoluted, complex history about why some groups at the top, why some groups at the bottom. And so, yeah, so, and along with that kind of grouping, why is it like these groups happen to obtain power and these groups didn't, right? And I'm very interested to hear from you, Santosh, like, whether in your own personal experiences, and maybe you hear it from other people, right? Because definitely in this book, Wilkerson talks about herself being other Indian scholars, and they are not in India. Some of them are even in the US, but they can't escape the caste status. So I can talk about that later, because I took some of those more colorful anecdotes to talk about later. But I'm just wondering for yourself, right? Have you had any of this like personal encounters? Yeah. So to make it more relatable.
Yeah. So is your question directed more from the point of view of like being an Indian with vis-a-vis other Indians, like in Singapore, or like just being an Indian in being someone in Singapore and the experience of caste in Singapore? Yeah,
Okay.
because caste is a
So
very
I would
yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So let's separate the two, right? So I'm asking the formal because I think the second question you asked is about the caste status in Singapore, and I think we have to address that later if we can find the right moment to interject and to talk about it, which is there a caste system in Singapore? So I don't have the answer. I'll be curious to hear what you think. But let's address the first part, right? Which is as a Indian person living in Singapore, whether it's through you, through your relatives, through people that you know in India itself, right? Like, do you have stories, your experiences as well with, notions of caste?
Yeah, yeah. So personally, I think it's not really bothered me. It's not really had a very big impact or influence on my life because I didn't really interact with many Indians growing up in Singapore. Yeah, so like, and so that cultural influence of India and the importance of caste in social interactions didn't really matter because I was out of it. But personally, I mean, having heard from accounts of relatives, like that's the whole concept of caste, intercaste marriages. That was something quite important. So caste, right, in India, the formal definition in it is called Jati. And so people from one Jati or caste do not really marry with people from another Jati or caste. Yeah, so there are restrictions on like who you marry. And it was quite monolithic. It was, the structures were quite rigid back in the past. But with the modern era and with a lot of discussions and this whole youthful effervescence of like social reform in today's time, this kind of discussions, like this is not really important. The choice of one's partner based on the partner's like caste compatibility or Jati compatibility is not really as important as like the love that one has with another partner. Yeah, yeah. I think, but then there comes the intergenerational tensions because the parents I've heard of instances where parents or grandparents object to marriages. Yeah. Uh, like in between people of the generation today. Yeah, and then so this creates a tension that we have, and I think this phenomenon is even more prominent in India than in Singapore. Yeah. Now there's
Yeah.
also another concept of caste, like in Singapore. Like then you have also kind of caste structure in terms of like the North versus the South. Yeah, the North Indians versus the South Indians. Yeah, and then there is this like hierarchy, right? That North Indians are actually superior than the South. Yeah, then there's another one based on the color of the skin, the colorism. Yeah, and so there is an artificial dynamic, yeah, or position of privilege where beauty is ascribed to those with whiter skin. So you'll notice like Bollywood, the actors and actresses, yeah, and then those who are given the roles to play like the top roles in films, yeah. So those are like maybe more fair skin than those which are darker skin, yeah. So these things like they are really evident. They have permeated the culture, and I think they have impacted society. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because definitely this is also I'm not a scholar on this kind of issues, right? So it's definitely something I pick up on the ground, so to speak, the idea about North versus South Indians. And I'm curious to hear from you, right? Like, because this is something obviously that came from India. It's not something that I would assume originated in Singapore in the sense that like, anyone that's Indian born in Singapore probably would share that kind of identity. They wouldn't be thinking, oh, my family is North Indian or my family is South Indian, and it's going to matter here in the context of the Singapore, yeah, um, in terms of Singapore population, right? Because in this sense, we are supposed to not care about this kind of labels and identifying markers, right? So do you think things have changed in that sense that, like the way you talk about how the older generation would have maybe scrutinized, a prospective, partner of their child, right? So a bride or groom to be, and really looked at their caste status. But now it's more like maybe a lot more about your class status instead. So yeah, do you think things have changed essentially?
Yeah, definitely. The whole idea of like class is still very important because of this whole idea of like passing down your wealth, yeah, and ensuring that like parents of similar class, socioeconomic class, certain status and privilege in society, and they want to maintain that through their genetic line. That's of primary importance. Yeah, so I think yeah, the idea of class is really it's become a lot more prominent. Yeah. In terms of caste, right? I think for me, like what has become a lot more prominent in my study of the ancient history. So this is like the ancient Vedic text as translated and as explained by the scholars, like, actually there is a difference. Yeah. The from the very spiritual point of view, right? This whole idea of one caste being more important or superior than the other, it's actually a more recent concept. It wasn't evident, it wasn't part of like the spirituality of the ancients. Yeah, so the spirituality of ancients, right, actually accorded everyone in society. Like it was a lot more egalitarian. So there was like equal dignity and worth to people across different different occupations or different like characteristics. Yeah. And so there was this whole idea of unity in diversity and the need for different parts of society to come together. Yeah. So I think like I don't know when this idea of casteism, yeah, where what you're born into, the caste that you're born into, right, matters so much in terms of your status, the privilege you hold, or the resources you're accorded. I think it was a more recent phenomenon. Yeah, when like power came into play, when like I think colonization took place, or even like the imperial invasions that took place in India, I think that concept become more important. Yeah, but from a spiritual standpoint, from my readings of the scholarly text, right, and what I've heard, it was never an important thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me say one thing about that, and then maybe you can go on to your next section, right? Which is what's so bad about caste, right? This is one of the criticisms of the book that we're actually reviewing, right? Which is it seems quite ahistorical, decontextualized, and other reviewers that I will mention later, have actually kind of said that the book should have done a better job in that because it didn't exactly give an idea about, as what you said, right? If you just read this book purely, you don't get a strong sense of like how the history of castes, at least in India, how it evolved and when they come from. There's a certain specificity to its historical uh, um, context, right? And how actually that would, to some reviewers, that is very different from how Wilkinson talks about caste in America, and how they don't think she applied the right kind of lens or analysis. But anyway, that's for later. Why not you get on to talk about,
Yeah.
why do we even talk about caste to begin
Yeah.
with? Yeah.
So Douglas,
Yeah.
I think you brought up a very important point. So I think for the benefit of our viewers, the technical terms for caste and the discussions in scholarly circles in India, right, with regards to caste, what you're born into, the technical term for that is called your Jati, Jati. Yeah. But actually, the ancients, right, their conceptions of caste is called Varna, Varna, which is not Jati. And Varna is a function of your aptitude, number one, and your inner cultivation. So, yeah, you can be born into a caste, like a Jati, which is of like, something fixed, right, based on your family lineage. But the role that you play in society is actually based on your aptitude or your inner cultivation. So, for example, let's say I'm born into the Shudras or the untouchables or the supposed untouchables. That's my Jati, right? But actually, the ancients and what we've seen, right, there have been a lot of enlightened, self-realized souls who became brahmanas, enlightened scholars, yeah, who were the real Brahmins of society. Yeah, and that is called the Varna that they play. Yeah, and it's through their internal cultivation and their natural disposition. Yeah, that they were revered as scholars, despite the fact that they were born into very poor socio-economic situations in society.
Okay, that's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. So the technical differences are between Jati and Varna. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Back into the book review. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of like my reading of the book, right? I've divided this into 5 different parts. Yeah. So I'll just explain the brief structure before we dive deeper into it. Part number 1 of the structure is caste is insidious and invisible. Yeah. It's very difficult to locate. Yeah. And very difficult to prove with objective metrics. You can't do quantitative studies on caste. It's very difficult to, through evidence-based research methods, show the existence of caste. So that's point number 1. After that, we'll move on into the effects of caste. What kind of effects can it have on society? The consequence, how harmful it can be. Then point number 3 is to show that actually the elimination of caste is quite difficult or impossible. And we'll look at 4 different forces that ensure that its elimination is impossible. And what are these 4 forces that prevent caste from being eliminated? And then the 4th point is what we call a break in transparency. Then what is a way to help us to render what is invisible, insidious, more visible, so that we can work around it and we can work towards social reform in society? Yeah, what is a glimmer of hope that we have, or the light at the end of tunnel? And 5th and finally, what kind of hopes the writer has for the future? Yeah, so this is a 5-part structure. Yeah, I have for the discussion, and Douglas, you can add in your own readings into the structure, or we can also amend the structure as we move along. So we start off with point number 1. Caste is actually insidious and very invisible. And so the point that we're trying to make, right, she's trying to make, is that the forces that reinforce caste are powerful, insidious, and difficult to detect. That's extremely difficult to prove and solve. So I'm just looking back at my civil service career. I can't go to my perm sec or my the head of civil service and say there's a caste structure. And then they will ask you like, oh, have you done any quantitative structure? What's your data? How can you prove it? Yeah, so if you can't measure it, then it's not. Yeah, we can't work at it. Yeah, so this is really why it's so insidious. It's there, but it's invisible. So what she's trying to say is this, I'm quoting her. We are rooting out justice by forcing an admission that A, is not likely to come, B, keeps the focus on a single individual rather than the system that created the individual, and C, gives cover for those who, by aiming at others, can present themselves as noble and bias-free for having pointed the finger first, all of which keeps the hierarchy intact. So what she says is caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it's not hatred. It's not necessarily personal. It's the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. For this reason, many people, including those we might see as good and kind people, could be casteist, meaning invested in keeping the hierarchy as it is or content to do nothing to change it, but not racist in the classical sense, not active or openly hateful of this or that group. Yeah, so this is the point that she's trying to make. Yeah, so Douglas, like any response to what I just said, that it's very difficult to do quantitative studies, and prove its existence and thus, work towards reform.
Yeah. So this is interesting actually. I read the book, like I said, about 70% of it, and I don't recall this part of the book. And instead, the parts that I have captured here would kind of slightly, I don't know, it could be slightly contradictory to this point actually being made. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Because you said that it's invincible, it's like kind of hard to detect, right? And I mean, the idea here is that we already have identified, in her own book, right, 3 case studies, right? So you got, like I said, the Nazi system, you got racism in America, and you got the Indian caste system, right? And it's funny, but when I think about it, yeah, I think you can pretty much look at it from a sociological standpoint and see, I would like to think objectively, that certain types of groups are actually discriminated and subjugated, right? Obviously, the kind of treatments that each of them receive can be very different, and that's one point that someone has brought up about how maybe the Nazi case study in her book doesn't fit so well because the Jews were basically eliminated. They weren't just made to be slaves or to work for the Germans, right? Or the Aryans. I mean, they literally wanted to eliminate the Jews. So that was quite far out there. But nevertheless, there is a similarity of oppression, prejudice, discrimination, also that runs through all 3. So where I'm going to slightly argue, but using the same points that she has in the book about the invisibility about it, right? Is so one of the story she has in the book is where she's, I think, in some kind of academic conference, and she's talking to a Dalit scholar. The name being quoted here is Suraj Yender, who was at Harvard. And what this Dalit scholar said was that there was another Indian scholar who was from an upper caste and a higher caste, sorry, and who came over to talk to the 2 of them. And essentially, this other scholar was, because by virtue of their name, their surname, their family name, he or she could sort of show off that, oh, I am of a higher caste than you, hence my points, my arguments, my reputation supersedes you. And so this particular Dalit scholar, I'm now quoting from the words here. I can't look them straight in the face. I can't look them in the eye. I don't know what to say. These were our masters. My grandfathers were the workers of their grandfathers. I would never be invited inside their homes. In India, they would not speak to me. Man, I could not imagine talking with them even here in America. They are of a completely different caste from me. He began pensing again. The trauma to cross that line. I've been here 3 years. I still do not have the confidence to talk with them. So it's very interesting for me to see that, right? Like in some sense, it doesn't seem so invincible. It maybe because we're the outsiders, right? If I'm there, I probably wouldn't know. And imagine for Wilkinson, maybe that's the point she's trying to make. She's not Indian. She doesn't speak their language. She doesn't belong. Has no experience with the system. So she doesn't really know how to identify. I agree with that. But it seems in some sense that the subordinates actually, and that's a very powerful argument from the book, which is like the subordinates are actually trained, and to quote directly, they're trained to admire, worship, fear, love, covert, and want to be like at the center of society, at the top of hierarchy. But you can't leave your caste. Caste never leaves you. That's according to what she argues. So interesting point. Yeah, and that's kind of like my response.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. No, I totally agree with where you're coming from, and I think this will lead us to the second point about the forces that actually reinforce caste. Yeah, and so we'll have accounts of like one of the forces is actually the subordinate caste will do what it takes to try to aim towards the higher caste, and the higher caste actually tries to preserve its caste as well. Yeah, so yeah, maybe I think when I say invisible, yeah, you're right. It's not so invisible. Yeah, I think what was the more technically or what I was referring to, right? And this is what I read is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations or patterns of social order that have been in place for so long. They look like the natural order of things. Yeah,
Yeah,
so this
okay.
is, yeah,
In that sense, yeah, let me just repose. Right. I mean, yeah, in that sense, I get what you're saying. Like, if you are born under the caste system, you have no idea you're living under that caste system, right? Because I'm speaking from an outsider's perspective, so it just doesn't seem so invisible. Maybe also because, we're reading the book, we kind of can see what we're talking about. But you're right. If you were born there and you didn't you were ritualized, indoctrinated into the system, you have no idea, right? You assume everything's natural.
yeah. So I think, yeah, this is a great segue to the second part of the structure that I had in mind, which is the effects of the caste. Yeah, and this is where you see how harmful it can really be and how painful or hurtful it has been. Yeah, and so there are 4 points to this. Yeah, so the first point that I think I recorded for the sake of the discussion is the subordinate caste is trained to admire and be more like the dominant caste. So standards, for example, beauty are defined over the infrastructure of caste. So this is point number one, an effect. Yeah. Point number two, with all other things equal, it could be like your education, your everything. A subordinate caste needs to conceal his attributes to not make the dominant caste uncomfortable. Yeah. So this is another like effect of the caste system and how hurtful it is. Yeah. Now, then the number three, right? There are double standards, intolerance of bad behavior between the dominant and subordinate caste. So you do see double standards. Yeah. And then another point. So number five, right? So sorry, one, two, three. Yeah, number four. Forced good cheer preserves the class structure and assuages the guilt of the dominant caste. Yeah. So these are like 4 points in terms of like the consequence of caste. And I can start with like the first point, right? The subordinate caste is trained to admire and be more like the dominant caste. Yeah. So the subordinate castes are trained to admire, worship, fear, love, covert, and want to be like those at the center of society, at the top of hierarchy. So people show a greater sense of joint responsibility to one another when they see their fellow citizens as like themselves. Beauty against which all others are measured, ranked in descending order by their physiological proximity to the dominant caste. So like in India, it's, for example, the color of the skin. Yeah, so there is a color, the more fair color of the skin that is more desired and coveted as compared to a darker skin tone. Yeah, so this is caste distinctions uh, based on color of skin for the standard of beauty. Yeah, and so there are other standards, intelligence or other things, yeah, based on other attributes. Yeah. So this is the first point. Yeah. Maybe I'll go to the second. Yeah. Where the with all other things equal, the subordinate caste will need to conceal his attributes to not make the dominant caste uncomfortable. So this is a quote from the book. The burden fell on those in the lowest caste to adjust themselves for the convenience of the dominant caste whenever in contact with white people. An African American man who managed to become an architect during the 19th century had to train himself to read architectural blueprints upside down, wrote the scholar Charles W. Mills, because he knew that white clients would be made uncomfortable by having him on the same side of the desk as themselves. Yeah, so this is something called concealment. And in sociology, there is something called the minority stress model, in which concealment is a very important part of how minorities uh, grow to internalize what are distal forces. Yeah, so this is another one. Yeah, then, okay, maybe I go to the third one. Double standards in tolerance of bad behavior between dominant and subordinate caste. That people would readily, this I quote again from the book, that people would readily accept his account if the perpetrator were black, and believe the dominant caste man over the subordinate people, focus on them rather than him, see the scapegoat caste as singularly capable of any depravity, and would deflect any suspicion away from him. Yeah. So part of me resented that she could go ballistic. So this she that she's talking about, right, is a white woman. Yeah, in a restaurant and get away with it when I might not even be believed it was caste privilege to go off in the restaurant the way she did,
it was a measure of how differently we are treated, that we could live for over 40 years and not experience what is a daily possibility for any person born to the subordinate caste. That it was so alien to her being the white woman. It so jangled her that she blew up over it. Yeah, so these are like three points. Yeah, so far, Douglas, any response to what I've shared?
Yeah, so I would, yes, I agree. Those are effects, but I also would classify them as the dynamics of caste, right? Like this is how the interactions between the subordinate and the dominant caste groups function, right? The subordinate is always trying to kind of like essentially butter up and try to assimilate, right? And learn the moral codes, the etiquette, the norms and the values of the dominant caste. What I have to add actually is because there's a part of the book which I thought was um, like this you could say everything you just mentioned is a bit more the intangible side. So I want to talk about the tangible effects. So for example, one of the things that she talks about is longevity. So basically people who are on the lower caste, and in this case, what she does is that she looks at scientifically this concept of telomites, which is a kind of a DNA strain, and that actually helps to measure your basically your longevity, in DNA terms. It's a measure of premature aging. And what she found, in her research, through the research she's accumulated, is that yes, when you are of a lower socioeconomic status and you are essentially of the lower caste, you tend to have lower telomites. And so that makes you much more susceptible to premature aging, and suffering all sorts of other comorbidities. So other things that she points out is, generally people who live, in this kind of very stressful circumstances, right? That they have a tendency to suffer from hypertension, obviously stress, and how she's able to pass this out, right? It's because she looked at, say, poorer Mexican immigrants in America, and here's very here's a very interesting part, and it's a bit controversial in fact, because based on what I've also read, is that what she said is that poorer Mexican immigrants have even longer telomites, meaning that they're healthier, they've got younger cells than Mexican Americans, the ones who are richer. So this doesn't seem to make sense because, if you are poorer, why is it that you actually seem to do better? And she thinks it's because they are newer to the country, they are more likely to cluster together in closer social support networks. So because they're a little bit much more isolated from the overall class or caste system in America, so that's why they're a little bit more insulated. So the irony actually is to her is that if you try harder to assimilate, right, which is what you were talking about, then you're actually going to subject yourself to even more stress and higher levels of inflammation as well. And she kind of backs this up because she said that it's the same thing if you look at Black people. So the African Americans as well, like they find something similar as well, that the more upper class that the African Americans are, actually, the more that they have lower life expectancy. So it's a very interesting finding. And the other important thing I feel about this is that, like, is what you said, right? Is it that invincible? Yeah, it's invincible when you're born in it. But once you start studying it, I guess you can see the salient effects, right? That basically, if you are living or you inhabit the subordinate or the prejudice group, you are actually suffering quite serious health effects from the negative self side effects from this.
Yeah. No, thanks for pointing that out, Douglas. Yeah, it's actually very salient and it's very tangible. Yeah. So the manifestations can be measured, as what you just mentioned, right? Yeah. And so in Singapore, it will be quite interesting to just measure lifespans of people across socioeconomic class. Yeah, that would be interesting, right? And then maybe we might find this a similar kind of like anomaly of poorer, lower SES people having higher lifespans because they are congregated around community. So they found a way to cope with it. Yeah, on the margins of society through community and not by subjugating themselves into the center.
Yeah, I think it would be really hard research, right? Because, for one thing, you've got to control the effects of class and I would say diet too. There's so many things you've got to control for. So income, obviously, socioeconomic status. And I think also, like, my opinion right now is that, when I read this kind of research, not that I don't believe it. It's obviously, the research shows what it shows, right? It's always more like the curiosity. The thing to find out is how does it work, right? Because in this case, taking what we're talking about in terms of caste, right? It's such a rich, complicated concept, right? It's not just simply about socioeconomic status, right? So you could imagine like you want to be able to find a controlled group of what you would consider subordinate participants and then the dominant participants, and you need like to design this in such a rigorous way that you really, really are measuring the effects of caste, right? So I mean, what I would say to all this is that maybe just take it for what it's worth, right? In the sense that whether we're talking about class, race, or caste, either way, right? As long as you are living on the lower end of the hierarchy, right? Because in some sense, uh, even if you take race as an issue, right? We know for sure the marginalized communities are the ones that are at the lower socioeconomic status. They are not the ones who can climb up the social hierarchy so easily. So yeah, I think either one way or another, you can see that we need to look at and address, how these negative health consequences and ramifications can be, how they can be remedied.
I find it super fascinating because this is very trauma-informed, aligned with trauma-informed like research, according to Dr. Gabor Mate. And basically what the research shows is actually the brain does not differentiate physiological pain from social pain. Yeah, and so it's the same pain. It's the same part of the brain which is firing if we're experiencing physiological pain or social pain. Yeah, and what he says is the antidote to trauma is actually connection, human connection. And one powerful way to heal from the effects of trauma is community. Yeah. So actually, what you say is like we have a solution, right? Communities of practice, communities which can come together and heal one another. That's like a powerful antidote for the effects of caste. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say like, yeah, this kind of, I mean, depends on how you want to structure what you want to go to next, but I would definitely want to take the point that you just mentioned, and if you want to do it now or later, talk about what Wilkinson is suggesting in terms of a solution, and that's where I want to express some of my skepticism. So anyway, go ahead. Let's see how we can address this issue about community has a solution. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I think before that, right, like there's just one final point about forced good cheer, which preserves the class structure and assuages the guilt of the dominant caste. Yeah, and I'm just going to share a reflection that my friend and I like have about this in relevance to the Singaporean context in regards to immigrants. Yeah, the trait, right, that we're measuring caste on is your immigration status. So this is what she says: in all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is a class requiring but a lower order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have. It constitutes the very mud seal of society. Yeah. Now, the status in which we have placed them, right, the one of this like lower subordinate caste, is an elevation. It's a forced good cheer. They are elevated from the condition in which God first created them by being made our slaves. Now, this is actually eerily similar to how Singaporeans, and the government say that maids of foreign workers would not make the same amount in their own countries and are therefore somehow better off by being in their stations in Singapore. Yeah, so this forced good cheer became a weapon of submission to assuage the guilt of the dominant caste and further humiliate the enslaved. And this is what we saw, right, really during the lockdown, when we organized all those events, segregated events, to bring the migrant workers away from their dormitories that they were entrapped in these like places, for them to just hang around and play around, have a game or two, and then go back to their dormitories, but not to intermingle with Singaporeans. Yeah, the idea of segregation was there, but this, like events that we organized, right, was just to assuage the guilt of the dominant caste. Yeah, and I was there, like, we were part of like a good space organizing these events. And I really recall so poignantly, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, you have your time to go out and hang around and just relax, but don't mix around with Singaporeans, okay? We give you some like protected zones to go and hang around amongst yourselves. Yeah. So they were thus forced to co-sign on their own degradation, to sing and dance, even as they were being separated from spouses or children or parents at auction. It is harder to dehumanize a single person standing in front of you, wiping away tears at the loss of a loved one, just as you would, or wincing is in pain from a fall as you would, laughing at an unexpected double entendre as you might. It's harder to dehumanize a single individual that you have gotten the chance to know. Yeah. So, this is like, the whole point about forced good cheer. Yeah. If you've got anything to
Yeah.
reflect on,
Yeah, no, I like what you brought up. I think this is very good because I think the point you made about, what is the reason behind trying to come up with excuses or justifications for, say, this kind of measures that deliberately segregate one group of people from the main population, right? Like, how we try to assuage ourselves by saying, oh, this is for their betterment, or this is for safety. Seriously, these reasons are not uh, yeah, they're not justifiable. I mean, there's not very strong reasons behind it. And also, the I think we should look at it this way. So I'm also going to give you a story that will also buttress what you're talking about. So when I was also working in government, there was a person, just think someone who's a more senior level executive who was in a retreat. So, in the retreat, you got, people of all different levels, together brainstorming and discussion, right? So you got even the senior senior civil service leaders as well. So anyway, this one person gets up and, just kind of like gives a little speech about, what we can do to just, improve our welfare benefits, or, something like that. It doesn't really quite matter what the real content is. But here is the important part I want to mention. Then this very, very senior civil service leader just sort of says, okay, you can say all that, but we're better than Africa, right? And to me, that's such a disingenuous argument. But it's very similar to what you just said about false goodwill. Why are they similar? Because it's basically a very lazy, fallacious argument about, like, well, if we just compare ourselves to the worst case scenarios, we are better, right? So of course that's easy to do. So if someone is, just to use a much more simpler example, analogy, if someone is, say, scolding their child, maybe, making a child, feel very bad, and, maybe verbally abusing it. I mean, you cannot just say that the person can then excuse that behavior and say, well, I'm not beating my child, right? I'm not raping him or her, so that's fine, right? So you can't use this kind of argument. And the same with the false goodwill argument. You cannot just say, well, this is better than what they would have gotten in their hometown. No, I mean, you got to look at the circumstances at hand. So in this case, if, for example, the argument that we're going to make is that foreign migrant workers, the way they're treated is almost like as if they're of a lower caste, then the question we need to ask is, what can we do to change that, right? And do we really have justifiable reasons for this kind of segregation, for the fact they cannot integrate or mingle with the general population, just as a normal part, a normal segment of being in Singapore, right? So that's what I wanted to say about that. Then, just to also dig in a little bit deeper, right? So one very interesting part of the book I really like, and it's going to kind of relate to this topic, what we're talking about, is there was a experiment. So a political scientist posed a theoretical question to white undergraduates, and he asked them, how much they would be paid to live the next 50 years as a black person. And the students thought it over and they said 50 million, because 1 million for every year that they have to be black. They felt they needed that to buy protection from discriminations and dangers that these white people also know they would face if they became black. Now, think of it this way, right? If I repose that question to a Singaporean, how much would you be willing to be paid to live the next 50 years as a migrant worker? I cannot imagine what they would say. I don't even know whether they could give me an answer where a certain amount of money is good enough. So, some food for thought.
Brilliant, and thank you so much for those anecdotes. 50 million is a lot of money. Yeah, just to live in a society. I'm like, I'd rather go back to my indigenous roots, or I just go to a farm and live off a farm.
Yeah, and the other thing I also wanted to say, but let me, perhaps you just go on to your next point first, because there's another very important part of the book which I really like, which is something to do with the weaponization of forgiveness. But and it definitely relates to what we just talked about. But perhaps you can go on to what you want to add on.
Yeah, great. So we'll move on to the third part, right? And then, okay, maybe I saying elimination is impossible is a bit too strong. I would say elimination is difficult. And I will go on to share one, two, three, 4 points about what we call the dynamics. I like the word that you said, dynamics, just now, Douglas. Yeah, so there are 4 dynamics that I think she talks about. And I'm going to just enumerate the dynamics, right? Even dynamic number 1, ordinary people are complicit in enforcing caste. The ordinary, yeah? Those who are maybe not even affected by caste, we are complicit. Number 2, dynamic number 2, the stigmatized stratify their own because no one wants to be in the last place. Dynamic number 3, the higher caste will do what it takes to preserve its position. Yeah, and this is going to be a long, I'm going to describe and elaborate on this dynamic number 3 for quite long. Then number 4, right? Equity-related issues may be met with what we call a reverse casteist resistance by the dominant caste. Yeah. So, for example, affirmative action or reservations. Yeah. Even if you introduce them, right, there will be an equal and opposite reaction, a reverse casteist resistance. Yeah. So those are like 4 dynamics. So I'll just begin with dynamic number 1. Ordinary people are complicit in enforcing caste. So it's the actions or the more commonly inactions. So these are errors of omissions and not errors of commissions. There are 2 types of errors that we commit: omission and commission. Yeah, so it's really the inactions, the omissions of ordinary people that keep the mechanism of caste running. The people who shrug the shoulders at the latest police killing, the people who laugh off the coded put-downs of marginalized people shared at the dinner table and say nothing for fear of alienating an otherwise beloved uncle. These are people of personal courage and conviction, secure within themselves, willing to break convention, not reliant on the approval of others for their sense of self, people of deep and abiding empathy and compassion. These are people you need. Yeah. So you cannot solve anything that you do not admit exists, which could be why people may not want to talk about it, because it might get solved if you admit that it exists. Yeah, so this is 1 point now, dynamic number 1. I'll move on to dynamic number 2. The stigmatized stratify their own because no one wants to be in the last place. So the anthropologist Laurent Mattery said, the stigmatized stratify their own because no one wants to be in the last place. Many recent African immigrants are better educated, better traveled than many Americans, may be fluent in multiple languages, and do not wish to be demoted to the lowest caste in their adopted homeland. The caste system encourages Black immigrants to do everything they can to build distance between themselves and the subordinated caste that they might be taken for. Yeah. So maybe I'll stop here before I go to a very long exposition or elaboration of dynamic number 3, which is about what the higher caste will do to preserve its position. Yeah. So any take on anything I've said before I move on?
Yeah, just maybe a very quick point that, one philosopher was quoted in the book, and it's a philosopher that actually was on our show, David Livingstone Smith. He's the scholar who wrote about dehumanization, a very prominent and very talented scholar on that topic. So, just to quote from him in this book, he said, it's tempting to imagine that Germans were or are a uniquely cruel and bloodthirsty people, but this diagnosis are dangerously wrong. What's most dangerous about the Nazi phenomena is not that Nazis were madmen or monsters, it's that they were ordinary human beings. So, just to go along with what you just said, right, when we talk about living in a caste system and how, you quoted a part of the book that was correct, right? That I also have, which is about how people who shrug their shoulders, people who use coded language to put down marginalized people, and they are afraid of alienating, maybe a racist uncle. That's the way that she wrote it. So we all have like you say, a part to play in terms of maintaining it. And we don't look at ourselves as monsters. We don't think like as if we are being uniquely cruel or vicious. So I think in that sense it goes back to maybe the original point, that there is some kind of invisibility about it, because if it's so indoctrinated into your culture, into your society, then you just think that we're all moral good people just simply upholding a system that is just and fair, right? But just like what we just said about the migrant workers as an example in Singapore, right? Obviously, the book covers the Jews, the blacks in America, so on, right? We can see that, well, honestly, when you take it apart, right, there is no reason for this kind of subjugation and discrimination. So yeah, so I think this is a very poignant point for all of us to reflect on.
Yeah. So I think this is something we can develop. It's called unconscious bias. So there are conscious biases and unconscious bias. And a lot of us have unconscious bias. We are biased, but we are really unconscious about them. Yeah, and you know why? Because the bias is located deep within the inner recesses of our heart. And I'm going to quote her. It's much harder to look into the darkness in the hearts of ordinary people with unquiet minds. That's where it really lies. Yeah, that's where caste really is. It's not like this physical manifestation. It starts and it's really in the hearts and minds of people. Yeah, that's where it is birthed. Yeah, so I'm going to quote her in this paragraph. Germany bears witness to an uncomfortable truth that evil is not one person. It is not one person, but can be easily activated in more people than we would like to believe when the right conditions congeal. It is easy to say, if we could just root out the despots before they take power or intercept their rise. We always think, oh, you just kill off that one person, right? Yeah, if you could just wait until the bigots die away. It is much harder to look into the darkness in the hearts of ordinary people with unquiet minds, needing someone to feel better than, whose cheers and votes allow despots anywhere in the world to rise to power in the first place. Think of Trump, think of Hitler, think of anyone else in human history. It's harder to focus on the danger of common will, the weaknesses of the human immune system, the ease with which the toxins can infect succeeding generations. Because it means the enemy, the threat, is not one man, it is us, all of us lurking in humanity itself. Yeah. So thanks for raising that point. I just needed to quote this part. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me also add, I think it's a good point, good time for me to add this thing, because so in the book, right, many a times she also talk about her own personal experiences, and one quite poignant one she talks about is her being on a plane and how she was kind of basically shoved aside, how a steward wasn't very helpful to her, and she also quotes certain police cases where a black person is abused essentially, and the police officer that obviously performed the deed is a white person. You can even think of the George Floyd case if you just want to think of something that's more recent. And this is one way I always found a good way to look at what we just mentioned about unconscious bias, because as you said, we all probably know we have some kind of bias, right? But the question is, can we interrogate it ourselves? And I always say that the best thing you can ask yourself is, what if the shoe is on the other foot? So that is one of the best, ways you can, analyze yourself, which is what she does in the book as well. She will ask, okay, if I'm a white woman, will I be subjugated to this, right? Same thing with, I think in this case, in our case that we were talking about migrant workers. Imagine if it's a bunch of Singaporeans living in India, and this bunch of Singaporeans are not allowed to patronize and go out and, be in the village or whatever, right? Like they are actually treated as the lower tier of the particular hierarchy in another country, right? And I mean, I'm just quoting India as an example, but just think of a fictitious one, right? Just imagine a bunch of Singaporeans being treated that way. I mean, I'm sure, for those of us who think of Singaporeans like as if, we can't be treated that lowly, we're not like so animal-like or whatever, right? Like you naturally feel outraged, but this is what we can sometimes do to other people of other nations, other nationalities, and we need to be watchful of that. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I can see like social experiments designed to allow people to switch places.
Yeah.
to empathize with each other, for like a period of time, like you switch places. It reminds me of like some like some series, like television documentaries, where you swap, like swap husband, swap wife, or I don't know, like like
There are
that. So you
some
swap cast.
studies or you're talking about TV shows where they do things
Yeah.
like that. I mean, the one is quite entertaining. I'm not asking anyone to watch it, but there's one where Paris Hilton and another friend of hers called, I think it's called Nico Richie or something like that, where they tried to be farmers. And then there is another one where I think a CEO is made to be a worker. But that being said, right, I want to say this thing about those kind of shows. I mean, those people just get like a few days at most of doing this experiment. They are going to be very comfortable after that.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like the effects that you see from such experiments. I mean, it's very, very short-lived. Yeah, maybe for a little while they gain some empathy. They realize, oh, this the people that I employ, oh, they're human beings too. But once they resume back to their very rich, disconnected lifestyles away from 99% of us, I feel they go back to their very or their old assumptions and prejudices. Yeah.
Definitely. Wow. Very painful. Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to the third dynamic. The higher caste will do what it takes to preserve its positions. So this is what you're talking about, right? When they go back to their homes, they revert back, right? The reversal, like why is it so automatic? Yeah. So I'm just going to read out some like excerpts and then share a bit about like Singapore. Yeah. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of it's going to be quite voluminous. That poor whites had little but their complexion to console themselves for being born into higher caste. When a hierarchy is built around the needs of the group to which one happens to have been born, it can distort the perceptions of one's place in the world. It can create an illusion that one is innately superior to others, if only because it has been reinforced so often that it becomes accepted as subconscious truth. It is a great lie on which their identity has been built. Just as the assumptions of inferiority weigh on those assigned to the bottom of the caste system, the assumptions of superiority can also burden those at the top with unsustainable expectations of needing to be several rungs above. His whole life is one anxious effort to preserve his caste, wrote the Dalit leader Bhimrao Ambedkar of the dominant caste. Caste is his precious possession, which he must save at any cost. So this was a question to Isabel Wilkerson in an interview. What impact do you think that has had or has on white people who are poor or who are in the lower part socioeconomically of the working class? And this is her answer. Well, it creates a false pedestal of standing that has got nothing to do with what one does. It is what you're born into. It also, though, creates an invisible false pedestal. It's a pedestal people cannot see. As I speak about, the caste system itself is like a building. This reminds me of Aaron Kehoe's, the interview that we had on race, right? And the building has joints and beams and the structure that we cannot see. But the building is there. And what makes it especially troubling is that one cannot see that there is a pedestal that one may be standing on that you had nothing to do with, and that was created well before you were born. Then you might not even recognize the advantages that you actually were born into. This is a phenomenon called privilege obliviousness. The other thing is that it can create easily activated resentment at anything that does not track with how one perceives oneself. I'm reminded of just myself. Yeah. In other words, the perception that someone who has been deemed lower or that one perceives to be lower than them, any advancement by someone in that group can be seen as a greater threat than it otherwise would be. There would be a greater investment in maintaining the caste system as it is and maintaining the hierarchy as we have known it to be. So this is what we call loss aversion. It's really painful to lose it. Yeah, it's a threat when you see someone else from below advancing. And I think that one way that it, shows up a lot is that we often say in our era that, people say that working white class voters will often be acting against their own interests
in opposing policies, for example, they may be geared towards working people, like universal healthcare, for example. But from the lens of caste, it would not be surprising that they might oppose policies that they fear could threaten their own status by assisting those that they perceive as being beneath them. And so from a caste perspective, it could be argued that they're actually acting in what they perceive to be their best interest, if their best interest is to maintain the hierarchy as it has always been. Yeah, so this is like quotes from the book and from an interview with Isabel. Yeah, so like my friend and I, we were discussing this, right? So what we say is the idea of caste is quite fluid in Singapore, for instance. There may be several caste hierarchies at play simultaneously. There may be one defined along race, one along nationality, and another line drawn along migrant workers and the rest. Another one, I would say, maybe your ability, physical, neurological ability. Yeah. So the author talks about those at fringes of the dominant caste feeling threatened. So I guess the size of that fringe, this is what my friend says, varies depending on which hierarchy we're looking at. Perhaps in Singapore, the 2011 election results were because of a significant proportion of dominant caste Singaporeans feeling threatened by the immigrants. And to save its skins, the government has responded by emphasizing the differences and drawing thicker lines across groups. Yeah. So these were like an amalgamation of reflections from both Isabel's book, an interview, an audio interview that someone had with her, and a discussion I had with a friend about its implication in Singapore. Yeah. So Douglas.
Yeah, this is very interesting the way you're trying to tie it to the Singapore case. But let me talk about the American case because, yeah, as funny as it is, I do read up quite a lot on American politics. So let me first say that she has a very interesting argument there because she's trying to address the question, why do working class white people vote against their own interests, right? And in America, unlike Singapore, there is a huge breadth, you could kind of put it that way, of different politicians of different political persuasions and spectrums. And one of my favorite politicians is Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is a white Jewish man, but he advocates very strongly for obviously the working class. And he's also sometimes being talked about as that one person who could breach the gap between conservative Americans and liberal Americans, because conservative Americans don't see him as a member of the establishment class because he is very working class, and he constantly fights for universal, healthcare and stuff like that. And then, yeah, at the same time, you've got what you just quoted, Wilkinson talking about why do some segment, right? There's going to be a segment of white working class people who will vote against someone like Bernie Sanders, to call him like, socialism doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. And, they want to side with someone like Trump, who really honestly does not do anything for them, right? So I think the explanation does go some way explaining, that there is an interest on their part that, if as long as we maintain a certain white superiority, and some of them are clearly interested in a much more dominant white ethno state. They even talk openly about succeeding, Texas seceding from liberal America, just the blue states. So yes, there's very powerful forces at play in a place like America where white people are very interested in keeping their dominant perceived class or caste status. They may not even understand the word caste, to be honest, right? But they see themselves in this, social hierarchy that we are better than other minorities, other ethnicities, and we need to maintain that, right? America needs to be a white Christian state. That's their ambition. So now, if you look at Singapore, it's definitely very different, right? I think this kind of dynamics and forces of tension and conflict between different races probably not so egregious, not so obvious, maybe not so salient. But I agree that like what you said, it's just that because we haven't taken a rigorous kind of like detailed analysis of how would one construct a caste system in Singapore, and remember one very important thing that when we talk about caste as a concept, right? One of the tenets is that you're not supposed to be able to move out of it. So, you could be a you could be a very poor, ethnic minority Singaporean, and you might not be, in my mind, considered part of a caste group, because the idea is that even the government or other people would say, hey, we want to give you opportunities to move out of being a lower class status, right? Whereas if you look at a migrant worker, I would say the case is more applicable, because we are not trying to provide the opportunities to move up and to become a normalized citizen, right? We almost, when I say we, are actually doing the government, um, does have policies and measures to ensure that they don't actually have a very easy way of trying to transit to becoming a regular member of society. So yeah, so I think what you pointed out, what you just talked about is interesting to think about. And There was something you were saying. It's slipping my mind now. But yeah, but just take it this way, right? That I think that the um, imposition of a caste system, right? Unconsciously or consciously, if you know you're in it, you're going to try to fight every way to maintain it. If you are obviously on the privileged side, on the advantage. Yeah.
I think something that I personally, I mean, I'm just trying to relate to like the lived experience of a Singaporean, right? I stay in Tampines in a HDB flat. Yeah. And then just on the outskirts of Tampines, we call it outskirts, the dormitories of the migrant workers. So we used to go there to visit them and then to like do relaxation sessions, right? Can we imagine a different Tampines, my HDB flat, right, and the Tampines Central Park, where actually like migrant workers lived in the same HDB flats as us, and then we will all intermingle and intermix at Tampines Central Park, and then they are like community gardens, and we'll all like work on the gardens together. Yeah, is that vision of living, playing, and working together like a possibility in Singapore, given how gentrified or how segregated housing is? Yeah. Then another thing that comes to my mind is like, on Sundays, right, on weekends, like we see foreign domestic workers concentrating in different parts of Singapore. Like, can we not have such concentrations, but instead more like intermingling? Yeah. So less concentrated, like, yeah, and then more dissolved. Yeah. Yeah. And then, we're just intermingling like with one another. Yeah. Is that even possible? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and I would even put it in a more philosophical way about like, is it really that wrong for communities to have their own space? So like the way you said it, right? Like domestic workers, right? Foreign domestic workers, they have their own spaces. So do I really want to take that away from them when if those spaces actually provide them some level of safety, cohesion, familiarity? So they may go to certain parks, they may go to certain shopping malls, and to me, it's kind of like to give a good example, because this is kind of in the news, right? Golden Mile Complex, right, is a place for the Thai community in Singapore to hang around and to build up businesses. And now that they're tearing it apart, separate, these Thai businesses and communities are kind of like split apart because they don't have another location to go to, so to speak, right? I mean, they're going to different places, but they're not going to be all together in one place, which Golden Mile Complex was that place, right? So yeah, it's interesting. I think philosophically, I don't really have a problem with their own spaces, because the more important thing is to give them something that they feel comfortable in, and like it's a central location that they feel like, hey, we can be there, we'll all be there, and we can all hang out. And if anything, I just don't want any regulations or any kind of policing around the area. Like let them be, right. I think that'd be quite cool. But you're right. When you then talk about, would we be comfortable? I mean, I'm talking about Singaporean citizens now, right, with foreign workers, let's put it that way, to be within our HDB communities, right, because they don't really live among us. Yes, then that's where I think, we will have to probe deeper about, you know, um, is it because of our feelings of bigotry and, prejudice, because we feel like we'll be in danger, when really do we have data to prove otherwise? No, we don't, right? And also, what's really preventing them from being able to live in HDB apartments? I could argue in a very objective kind of way. It could be just scarcity. I mean, there's enough Singaporeans out there who want their own flats and they're not getting it. So, it could be more a question of that, right? But yeah, to your point, right? I think the idea about like we should develop more integrated spaces and we should be more welcoming, just in general. right, for them to be part of a community.
Yeah, no, thanks for elucidating a blind spot. Actually, I didn't realize that actually the point that you made, right, philosophically was accommodations. Actually, we should make more accommodations to those who need these resources from a point of equity. So they need their spaces to congregate and to build community, right? So that's an accommodation point of view. On top of accommodation, and what is mutually reinforcing and complementary accommodation is the intermingling. So we should also then embrace and intermingle with them. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's actually the onus and responsibility of, let's say, the more privileged part of the society to build accommodations for them. Yeah. And also to integrate in them. Yeah. And allow them to come and integrate with them. Yeah.
I would also just want to add on, like, maybe to me, the other issue at hand is, and this will relate to caste, right? Is that if we are talking about migrant workers and their accommodations, their living arrangements, I mean, I think they deserve much higher standards and conditions, in terms of the dormitories they stay in, right? I mean, I know that, there can be very fanciful ads and PR campaigns that show that, oh, they're living in like utopia. Obviously, I do not think so. I don't think any sane person would think that they are living in such great conditions. I get it that we want, I mean, let me put it this way, not we, but the government is going to try to make more efforts to provide more services, facilities, give them a gym, give them a cooking area, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the specifics don't matter to me. It's really more about like, when you measure it in general, right, on a more, let me put it this way, or maybe on a human rights level, is it satisfactory and is it fair? And I would argue maybe not. Yeah.
Talking about Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie swapping places, during the lockdown, the then Minister for Manpower, who said, up till now, no migrant worker has come to me and asked me to like apologize. Do you remember that remark that she made in Parliament? Yeah, could you imagine her swapping places and living in one of the bunk beds? It's a bunk bed, so in that one room, there are like 8 to 10 of them or even more sharing like bunk beds. Yeah, so one bed, one row of beds could have 3 people sleeping on 3 different levels. Could she imagine herself sleeping in one of those bunk beds? And then in one floor is one shared toilet for each floor. Yeah, could she do that? And then one recreation room for the whole dormitory. One TV room and all. Like, yeah, I've seen this firsthand. It's very difficult. Yeah. I mean,
and not to mention even their pay. Even their pay is like very, very minimal. It's clearly not up to standards for what a global living wage should be. That's what I would also add to that. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that the way you said it, right, that the then minister, uttered something, in order to defend herself. Well, no migrant workers complain to me. Well, duh, of course, because you are the minister. I mean, which person of this class or caste is going to come up to you and be honest about their feelings and possibly risk their livelihood, right? Because the minute you voice out, you complain, you can be sent back, which is what happened to one particular, which is what happened to one particular activist, migrant worker, right? I don't remember his name right now, but he was a very prominent guy. He was around for many years, and because he participated in some activist campaigns, he exerted his freedom of speech to talk about the poor conditions of the dormitories. He was sent back, and this is a person who was given many years to life in Singapore, and just like as I mentioned just now, there was no pathway for him to be not even a citizen, much less a PR. So there you go.
Very rich discussion. Thank you so much for this. Yeah, I think we can go on and on because I think there's another part of this that I'm exploring, which is fully inclusive schools in Singapore. And then when you said, no, it's not so straightforward. You can't just intermingle right away. Neurotypical and neuroatypical children, which is like the vision. Actually, there needs to be other things, accommodations and transitions. Yeah, so I think we can discuss that in another like segment on neurodiversity and fully inclusive schooling. Yeah, which is another topic I'm fascinated with because it's also casteist, based on what you're born with, your physical ability or your neurological ability, and whether you fit the mold that the society is designed around, or you don't fit the mold. Yeah, so arbitrary. I could have been born with the same, that neuroatypicality or that physical handicap, and my life would have been very different. Yeah, all of a sudden. Yeah. So just a lot of things to talk about. Okay, so another point that she made, right, is equity-related issues may be met with a reverse casteist resistance by the dominant caste. So what is called affirmative action in the US is called reservations in India. And they're equally unpopular with the upper caste in both countries. Language tracking in lockstep with complaints of reverse discrimination in one and reverse casteism in the other. Once labor, housing, and schools finally began to open up to the subordinate caste, many working and middle-class whites began to perceive themselves to be worse off by comparison and to report that they experienced more racism than African Americans, unable to see the inequities that persist offer in their favor. In a caste system, there can be little allowance for the disfavored caste to appear equal, much less superior at some human endeavor. Yeah, so it's just very bleak. Yeah, it's just sad lah. Yeah.
I was thinking, given the amount of time we have left, you want to get over to your last couple of portions has to do with solutions, right? And hopes, right? Shall we get to that? Because I think we can have another very rich discussion there, and then that's where we can end before you have to go for your next thing.
Great. Yeah. So basically, right, the light at the end of the tunnel that she pointed to is what I call fish does not know the existence of water. Yeah. So because it's so invisible and transparent, you need a land animal or an amphibious animal that is able to be on land and then come into fish, the water that the fish is in, to tell the fish that is the transparency of the water. Now, that is a metaphor for what we mean is if we hold spaces for conversations where people from different cultures come together and share from an ethnographical point of view, their qualitative lived experience. Yeah, the kind of burdens and obstacles that they have been in their life, as well as the enablers, the privileges that they have in a very transparent way, you can then see what is and map out the more visible layers of caste in a society. Yeah, so this is one solution that I think can work in Singapore is if we hold spaces for people to come from different cultures to shed light on this invisible caste structure that we have. Yeah, so I'm going to share a bit okay, maybe I won't do this. Okay, so I'll just share one point. So this is about an African a person who was African who went into the US. So he discovered that in America, he was not seen for his skills or his education. He was seen as Black before anything. It was an identity he was unaccustomed to, that had no meaning back home where everyone had similar coloring. Now it seemed to mean everything. So this is a qualitative lived experience, right? From someone from a different culture, from Africa, coming into America and shedding light on this more, this insidious nature of caste. What she meant from the above paragraph was that until you come to the US, they themselves do not see themselves as Black. They are Igbo or they are Ndebele or they are Yoruba. Whatever it is that they are in terms of their ethnicity and identity, it's only when they enter into hierarchy such as this, do they then have to think of themselves as Black. But back where they are from, they may not have to think themselves as Black because Black is not the primary metric of determining one's identity. So you've got and I'm just reflecting this, this is what Joe Biden said when he described fellow candidate Barack Obama. This is what he said in inverted commas. You've got the first sort of mainstream African American who's articulate and bright and clean and nice looking guy. Notice the innuendo and what is being sub-communicated in this. The remark was made the same day Biden filed the official paperwork to launch his presidential campaign. Biden then later apologized and said the remark was taken out of context. Yeah. So I'm gonna I just shared this. Yeah, it's when this few anecdotes, and then I'll share a story that I learned about a person from Sweden who came into Singapore, who shed light on caste along a nationality in Singapore. Yeah. But before I do that Swedish example, or shall I just share about the Swedish example? I'll just share it very quickly. Yeah. Okay. So basically, right, this Swedish foreigner came in Singapore, and she hired a foreign domestic worker who was working for her. And she was just so horrified and traumatized by having uh, someone from a different nationality, working for her in the same household, that she left Singapore and she went back. And in her description, right, in her anecdote, she said that back in Sweden, it's so egalitarian that you don't differentiate. There's no power difference between people like in a household. And when she came to Singapore, she shed light on something that is so invisible to us, right? We are so accustomed to having foreign domestic workers coming, maybe clean our house and all. Yeah. So it's when we hear lived experience of people from different cultures that we can then begin to tease out and draw or delineate the caste structure of our own society. So that's the silver lining that I have. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting that you call it a silver lining. So here's where things get interesting. So let me first say, I want to give a good, not say defense. I may not necessarily be defending it, but just to kind of lay out what Wilkerson is hoping, the book would do, what kind of further action, or what the book can inspire people to do, right? So towards the end of the book, which I did read, right, it's like her talking about how she is kind of preaching at this point, right, that we need to practice radical empathy, and she talks about how empathy is no substitute for experience. We don't get to tell a person with a broken leg or bullet wound that they're not in pain, and those who have hit the caste lottery, they're not in a position to tell people who have suffered under the tyranny of caste what's offensive or hurtful or demeaning. She talks about how every spiritual tradition says love your neighbor, not tolerate them. None of us choose to be none of us chose the circumstances of our birth. We have nothing to do with being born into privilege or under stigma. And another point that she also makes out is that the fact is the bottom caste, though it bears much of the burden of the hierarchy, they did not create the caste system, and the bottom caste alone cannot fix it. The challenge has always been that many in the dominant caste who are in a better position to fix caste inequity have often been least likely to want to. Caste is a disease, none of us is immune to it. But nevertheless, she persists, to insist that what and I'm quoting here: if enough people buy into the lie of natural hierarchy, then becomes the truth, or it's assumed to be. But once awakened, then we have a choice. We can be born to be dominant caste, but choose not to dominate. We can be born to a subordinate caste, but resist the box others force us to. So essentially, it's a very individualistic kind of further up action and inspiration, like I said. And this is where basically it comes down to what is your sense of hope, right? In terms of, oh no, I shouldn't say that. What is your theory of social change? Do you really think individual actions like this, a book like this, even if read by the millions, right? Even if read by every white person in America, for example, are they really going to be so motivated and moved by her text and to want to, upend, this caste system? And this is where, like I said, there are certain criticisms out there which I agree where they have spotted her blindsidedness, right? So one thing to say about where I do think she gets it a little bit wrong, so I think the Indian caste system is kind of more concrete. You can kind of diagnose it, break it down, and you can really, really decipher something of a caste concept operating there. But when it comes to the US system, to some critics, they think that she's using it too interchangeably with race, right? Because in the case of the US, what's very, very uh, salient in terms of creating all these unequal relationships is because of capitalist relationships, right? Immigrants basically they bear the blunt of the drudgery work, the menial work, as you mentioned, and people are exploited really because of the labor that they perform. And so it's not exactly like they are operating in the same caste concept as in India, where they can't rise out of it. They kind of can be given the chance to get out of it, but it's just that there are many, many obstacles, structural inequities and stuff like that, that prevent them from doing so. Just like the way I talk about, a migrant worker here in Singapore. And so going back to what you said, Santosh, about um, the domestic worker, right? The Swedish woman, right? So, I think that's very good, right? It's an example that I also like to use with other Singaporeans, to tell them, hey, what we have in Singapore is very unique. The fact that, okay, I shouldn't say almost every household, but many households, right? A very, very high percentage of households have foreign domestic workers, even from, not just the upper class, but even lower middle class. Some of us do have the ability to hire foreign domestic workers. And we should see that as a function of us not fighting for better labor rights for ourselves, why, or better living standards for ourselves. Why do we feel compelled to have to hire foreign domestic workers, right? Many Singaporeans will say something like, oh, I work from 9 to 9, I need someone to care of the kids. There is a lot of housework to do. I need someone to send the kids to school and all that. But, many other families in other countries have the same issues, but they are able to get around it even without having a foreign domestic worker, right? So I always try to post that to people and to see that, no, it's not like as if we we have some kind of special condition to require them. We simply have the convenience of doing so because of the way that our government has structured our economy, the way it's also stifled our lives, so that we feel like we're compelled to have to use foreign domestic workers, and or maybe even buy cars, right, in order to get about with our daily chores and duties, right? So going back to what you said about caste relationships, right? So yeah, like the way we see ourselves in relation to a foreign domestic worker is troubling. I know that there are a little bit much more progressive attitudes, so to speak, like more and more Singaporeans feel like, okay, we want to treat our mate as part of the family, and we, provide, good living conditions for her, right? But it nevertheless, goes back to your point, right? Which is we may be saying all these things just to make ourselves feel better, you know. And also we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that just because we are paying them, right? So it's going to necessarily lead to like a much more prosperous future for the country as a whole. I can understand individually that certain, domestic workers, they do benefit a lot from, earning our currency. They can send money back home. I get it, but that's on a very, very individual level, but it doesn't address, societal issues for them.
Thanks for highlighting this. I think a very important point that you made just now is the economics of care. Yeah, we have artificially depressed the wages and the salaries for care work. Nurses are heavily underpaid. This is care work, important care work, right? Housework, so foreign domestic workers who take care of our homes, right? Yeah, and then like the real care work, caregivers of persons with special needs and all. Like, yeah, and those people who are hired to take care of like persons with special needs. Yeah, and then maintenance work, those who build and maintain our society. So these are like parts of work, yeah, that if we raise the levels of the wages to the point that it's around the same relative to other countries, yeah, vis-a-vis the other occupations in our society, it wasn't so unequal in terms of pay or wages, right? If we lifted them to where they deserve to be, as in comparison to other countries, then the locals will come and do these jobs. Yeah, because then we value the work, and when we value the work, then we will take on the work. We will, yeah, because we will pay for it. So actually, yeah, it's
I just want
economic.
to add, that what you said is so true, because I have someone I know, a friend who actually looked into how much it would cost to hire a domestic worker in Australia, and it comes up to a very high salary. It's like I think $7,000 per month. So imagine if a Singaporean was being told, oh, you know what, you really should be paying 5 to 7,000 a month monthly salary for your domestic helper. I mean, it really would change the relationship and the outlook, and the valuation of their work.
Absolutely. So actually what you're saying is it's a structural economic issue. Like actually it's structural, it's designed into the system. And that, yeah, we don't talk about that. Like, if we just raise the wages relative to the other occupations, then things might shift. Yeah. So thanks for sharing this.
Let me just add one more thing about going back to Wilkerson and the book, right? So again, it's just another one of those criticisms that I found quite. I think it does apply in this case here. So I did enjoy the book. I did think there's a lot there that she shares that is, it's poignant. It makes you think a lot about lived experiences, and I think it's great that a book like that exists because as faulty as the analysis can be then criticized, right? But I think it's good to see it from the eyes of a woman who feels like, because she's black, she feels mistreated, undervalued, and she's looking at all these very complex systems, right, from Nazism to black racism to the Indian caste system. It's a very ambitious task to tie all these three cases together and try to do something coherent out of it and to find the similarities. But it's also just important to point out the differences. And so that's why I mentioned the thing about how maybe with the blacks in America, it's a lot more due to a capitalist system that puts them into a caste system, right? And maybe the Indian caste system, from what I understand, you got other themes or other factors like what religion you belong to, and what you mentioned skin color, right? I mean, maybe for the black people in America, it doesn't matter how dark or how light the skin color is. It's not really because of that they may live under a minority class or caste. But the other important thing to say anyway, just to kind of give my last point about the book, is that, I think the way Wilkerson looks at the issue is also from a very caste privilege perspective. So just one simple thing that I read from a review is that she never mentioned capitalism, not even once in the entire book. And that's quite startling, right? Because she's not even looking at economic relationships and how they have such a huge part to play, when it comes to inequality, basically, right? And all this kind of marginalized and negative effects, right? So, so basically, let me put it this way: it's kind of like my take on books like this. Like, and there's another anti-racist book called Robin. It's called, sorry, Fight to Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race. Right? It's written by this very famous author as well, Robin DiAngelo. Right? So this is kind of my advice to people who've at least come this far to listen to us. Right? Sometimes if you look at a New York Times bestseller, be a bit more scrutinizing, because there are many authors out there like Steven Pinker, who else? Tim Ferriss. I'm just picking names right now, but all these people are New York Times bestsellers. Angela Duckworth. And the problem is that we don't get the counter arguments sometimes because they are not going to be bestsellers. They sometimes can be academic scholarly texts, and I actually take the trouble to look into them because I don't always sometimes buy that what a mainstream bestseller is arguing is the definitive truth. There can be holes in the analysis. There can be, a wrong way of looking at things. There can be data that they obfuscate that they didn't look into. So, this kind of what you can call anti-racist books or mainstream centrist anti-racist books, right? Sometimes what they do is that they tend to individualize the problems, which is what we just said, which is the advice that she gives at the end is very like, okay, this is on a one-to-one basis. If I'm a dominant caste, I need to be a kinder, more empathetic person. Okay, fair enough, but is that really going to solve societal white caste systems? Right? I don't think so, right? So that's why when you read the more the counter arguments, right, then you get into more sociological analysis, things about like labor exploitation, capitalism, economic dispossession. So I'm going to, in the description box for this video, put two critical reviews of the book. They come from the Boston Review, a great periodical. So it's just to, again, to encourage people, read this book still. I still very much enjoy reading this book, but just try to expand your mind and look at other texts as well, because it's good to get a much more well-rounded, critical analysis.
Thanks for sharing that, Douglas, because I admit to being one of those readers who get into the book and then who get so riled up and so like passionate about the book. Like, why? Because it speaks to me, like it speaks to my lived experience, and then you lose all objectivity because you're in your emotions, you're in your feelings, Yeah. So I think that critical lens, like critical reasoning, yeah, the spirit of inquiry that you talked about, looking at other points of view or other sides, that's so important. Yeah.
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 And look,
so I think that advice that you gave to the viewers applies to me. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, no problem. I mean, look, it's just that for me, I feel like, we need to, and first thing, let me first acknowledge also from a position of privilege somewhat, that it's not easy to sometimes retrieve this kind of text, right? So I'll give you a good example. Steven Pinker has a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. But there have been many scholars who have countered the arguments he's made in that text. But you're going to be very hard pressed to find these arguments. They're usually in journals. Sometimes they can be academic books, but they are not going to be bestsellers. They're going to be maybe even a bit expensive. So all I would encourage is just that, don't just take a bestseller to be gospel truth. That's all I would suggest. Try to always look outside, look a little bit beyond what the text is arguing for. And, like I said, sometimes it doesn't mean that the truth, it doesn't mean that the book is not valid. It just means that maybe it's just a slice of a complete picture.
So I guess the same applies to the number of views that we get for our channel, the number of subscribers as well. Yeah, so don't take that as an indicator of the value of the channel and the value of the content that we produce.
Nice one, nice one. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So maybe Santosh, you may want to
conclude.
conclude. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just share 3 beautiful fairy tale hopes for the future that the author shared. So in a world without caste, instead of a false swagger over our own tribe or family or ascribed community, we will look upon all of humanity with wonderment. I say that when you buy a house, you're not responsible for how it was built unless you had it built yourself. But if you buy an old house, you're not responsible for how it was built. You did not build the beams and the posts and the pillars and the joints that may be now askew, but it's your responsibility once it is in your possession to know what it is that you now occupy, and it's your responsibility to fix it. No one had anything to do with the creation of the caste system that we've inherited. But now that we are in it and we recognize it, and we are here, however we got here, whether we were brought over and where we came over in ships, either in our choice or not, whether we have recently arrived, we are now in the structure, in the old house that now belongs to us. And it's our responsibility now to deal with whatever is within it. Whatever's wrong with it is now our responsibility, those of us alive here today. So that's, I guess, a fitting conclusion to her book. And to look at everything with a bit of wonderment and humility. Yeah, and thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Let me just say thanks, Santosh, for leading this discussion. I just to let the viewers know, I'm actually going through a coughing and flu bout, so I'm very appreciative of Santosh taking this session on. And like I said, despite whatever criticisms we may have made about the book, but I still think it's a great read. I think there's a reason why it's like on the Oprah Winfrey's top 10 list or something like that. It's very readable. I think I agree with Santosh that even though I'm not, Indian, I'm Chinese, but, I could still kind of get something out of the book, understand a bit more about the intricacies of caste, and understand that it's still a very live concept for, some of us living today. So please, if you read the book or you haven't read the book, have a read and, enjoy our video. Yeah. So thanks a lot for hanging around.
And leave a like and a comment in the box below. Thank you so much, Douglas, for team tagging with me and for accompanying me on this beautiful journey of the book review on caste.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.